నమస్కారం. డాక్టర్ బిఆర్ అంబేద్కర్ సార్వత్రిక విశ్వవిద్యాలయ విద్యార్థులకు స్వాగతం.
Hello students, did you hear about Uttaranchal disaster and Failini in the coastal area? What do you mean by disaster and how these disasters are caused? Whatever we heard just now, they are natural disaster. Then who has to manage this and how it has to be managed? All these things we are going to give in today's topic, disaster management. Before going for the disaster management, let us know about disaster. To become a disaster manager, it is important to know the key terms like, for example, definition of disaster or hazard and which area is vulnerable and who is vulnerable, and how to reduce the effects of disasters and how to mitigate the situation. Now, let us go for the terminology hazard and disaster or calamity. Hazard is a dangerous or event, either man-made or natural, damaging life, property and livelihood. Similarly, the disaster. Disaster is a man-made or natural event, in most cases suddenly and unexpectedly occur, resulting in widespread human loss. Disasters can be of different types. It can be natural disaster, air accident, railway accidents, chemical disaster and biological disasters and nuclear accidents. Now let us see what are the different types of natural disasters. The natural disasters are, for example, like earthquake, floods, tsunami, volcanic eruptions, landslides, which are termed as natural disaster. I think you can see that on your monitor, the disasters of Uttaranchal, where heavy flood has led to the landsliding and damage to the property and damage to the life. Similarly, here there are certain pictures where you can see some of the volcanic eruptions, severe landslides and road damage and the whole city damage. Then what are man-made disasters? Man-made disasters are like leakage of toxic gases, explosions, etc. For example, on your monitor, you can see the disaster of leakage of Bhopal gas tragedy. Nearly 23,000 people are dead because of this leakage of gas, and so many deaths of life has been observed. Similarly, in recent cases of Hyderabad and other parts of the India, where we have seen bomb explosions. These bomb explosions led to death and loss of property again. Now, let us see what are the different natural disasters that which will occur in India and what is the percentage of loss. Over 65% land area is vulnerable to earthquake in India. Similarly, 70% land under cultivation prone to drought and 5% of land to floods, 8% of land to cyclones, and a major disaster occurs every year, nearly 2 to 3 years, and 50 million people are getting affected annually, and 1 million houses damaged annually, along with the human and social and other losses. Now then, what are the general effects that which we come across during disaster? The first effect will be loss of life, injury, damage and destruction to the property, damage and destruction to the production, disruption of lifestyle, loss of livelihood and disruption to essential services, damage to essential infrastructures, disruption to governmental system, national economic loss, sociological and psychological after effects. Then who is vulnerable for all these disasters? Generally, we find this vulnerability is the extent to which the community can be affected by the hazard. It can be due to several causes present in the community. Like for example, like poverty, age and gender, lack of information, illness and disabilities, socially privileged or underprivileged, inadequate safety precautions. For example, let us take the cyclone affected in the coastal areas of AP, like Felony, where hundreds of people became homeless and loss of life is observed. Generally, during these disasters, women and children are vulnerable, especially the pregnant women and lactating mothers and infants are more prone to such disaster effects. Here are some of the pictures where we can see the people who are living in thatched houses or caned houses near the coastal areas. They are more prone to the disasters, and generally the old people, they succumb to all injuries. Similarly, the children. I think here is one small case study, like for example in Kumbakonam of Chennai, where hundreds of people were burnt alive during school days when they were preparing for the midday meal. It's one of the man-made disaster where the fire made the children to die. In order to avoid death of these vulnerable people, we can make the children aware of all the disaster management. Now then, what is a risk? A risk is high vulnerability and high hazard are associated with high disaster risk. Risk is expressed as hazards into vulnerability divided by capacity. Then what are the elements of risk? Risk is seen among people, livestock, rural housing stock, houses are vulnerable, crops, trees, telephone, electricity and boards, working implements, personal property, electricity, food supplies and infrastructures are the main vulnerable areas, or they are at the risk. Now let us go for the exact topic, that is disaster management. The disaster management can be defined according to Commonwealth government programs. Like Commonwealth government recognized 4 elements of emergency and disaster management. For example, the PRRP. P stands for preparedness, R stands for response, next R stands for recovery, and last P, prevention or mitigation. Preparedness is measured to ensure communities and services are capable of coping up with the effect of disaster. Response measures taken in anticipation before and after effects. Recovery is measures support to affected people, helping in reconstruction of houses, restoration of economic and emotional well-being. Prevention is measured to eliminate or reduce severity of the disaster. This is a small diagrammatic representation where you can see the disaster and how we can cope up the disaster or how we can manage the disaster in 4 steps. Number 1 is the preparedness, second is response, and third is recovery, fourth is prevention or mitigation. Then what is preparedness and how we can do this? Preparedness is making people aware of the disasters by means of awareness programs and education. Then who has to take part in this awareness program? The rural people, urban people, as well as the students. Students are the main important structures who can understand more about disaster and can just avoid disaster effects. Here is some pictures what I am showing you, where in Rajasthan and Gujarat a community has been developed and they were made aware of all these disaster management programs. Similarly, in schools also the disaster management programs are given out. Participation of students is very, very important. As I have already told you, the students are the main nation builders. They can know each and every part of the disaster management, and they can learn this disaster management by means of awareness programs, conducting workshops, conducting trainings, etc. Similarly, the next step in preparedness is mock drill. Mock drill training is this can be done by some of the important again student activities, like for example NCC and NSS, where here is an example. NDRF personnel from Arakonam demonstrated the techniques on how to handle natural disasters and man-made disasters, and nearly 100 cadets were trained in this program. Among the colleges, NCC and NSS should actively take part in learning about the disaster management. Under this, they can just create a situation and then they can avoid the situation by means of mock drilling process or mock drilling training. This is one way of understanding about the disaster, but apart from this, we can also avoid disaster by means of certain systems like warning system. Warning system is something you give precautions to the people or the society or the community before the disaster occurs. These are termed as special systems and they are very much required. For example, warning system, emergency operation centers, control centers, direction and coordinating authority, communications and survey and assessments, information management. For example, here is one example I can give you. The insert, it is giving a lot of information before an earthquake can occur in any place. That means by understanding the P waves, the earthquakes are well known before it can damage the property or before it can demolish everything. There are certain pictures on your monitor where you can see different types of disaster management warning systems. The first one, you can just know about it, how the insect is useful in understanding the tsunamis as well as the cyclone. Similarly, the second method of disaster management is relief and response. Then what do you mean by relief and response? Relief and responses are nothing but activation of emergency centers. For example, the community emergency response teams can be activated and disaster relief can be done by means of a temporary housing and a temporary shelter giving, etc. Similarly, relief by means of giving them food, arrangement for them with food and clothing and etc., which can help in the protection of the individuals or the community. Here are certain pictures where we can see temporary shelter and deployment of search and rescue teams can also be employed so that we can minimize the disaster effects. Like we can see here some of the pictures where only canvas shelters can be given and or pakka houses can also be given. Similarly, we can activate the rescue teams and we can even deploy some of the searching agencies who can just go under the debris and search for the bodies or the live organism. Similarly, some of the pictures here we are seeing the rescue people, how they are able to rescue the people who have suffered a severe damage at high altitudes or under the ground or below the buildings. Now, after this allotment of relief and response committee, we can also go for disaster management plans. Disaster management plans are something like you plan how to cope up the disaster effects. This can be done by the disaster management committees by preparing emergency plans for their communities. Like they can form some groups and plan how they can mitigate the effect. Next to this, the most and very important part of disaster management is medical camp and community kitchens. Community kitchens means where they can provide lot of food for the disaster affected people. At the same time, even the medical camps can also be organized. In this medical organizations, they can provide drugs and they can even go for the blood donation camps by means of different organizations or by means of different volunteers. Coming to the third one, recovery and rehabilitation. Create awareness on health and safety measures. That is very important. Then you go for the counseling of the affected people. Then go for the restoring services like building up of the roads, communication, and temporary houses and financial support. All these three are the most important factors which can help the disaster affected people. Coming to the fourth point, planning, prevention and mitigation. This includes prevent habitation in risk zones, finding way to reduce risk, community education and awareness. Out of all these things, education and awareness is very, very important. For example, here are certain more examples I could give you on your monitor. Like we can go for a disaster resistant building construction in the flood areas, where you can build the houses at an elevated position and the roof should be almost like conical. Similarly, the flood resistant and cyclone resistant buildings and earthquake resistant buildings can be constructed. Under this earthquake resistant buildings, we can go for RCC roof buildings and the bricks should be hollow. Now, let us go for finally the specific hazards and mitigation. For example, the earthquakes and the effects and how to mitigate it. Earthquakes causes damage to the buildings. Casualties are often high, fractures, injuries and sanitary conditions leading to epidemics, etc. And mitigation is, or how to improve this problem, can be seen by building or designing the proper building, and do not build the house on soft soil, and follow BIS guidelines to construct the house, and building plans should be approved by the municipality, and create awareness, giving trainings to the architects, builders and engineers. Similarly, the next is landslides. Landslides causes physical damage, block and bury of the roads, causes maximum fatalities, and this can be mitigated by hazard mappings, preserve natural vegetation, construct retaining walls to stop land slipping, increasing vegetation. Cover is the best method. That means out of all these things, to avoid landslips or landslides, create the natural vegetation or preserve the natural vegetation. Similarly, the floods. Floods can lead to the structural damage by washing waters, boats, fishing, equipment may be lost, and people and livestock deaths caused by drowning and outbreak of epidemics. And contamination of water is most common. Mitigation can be done by mapping of the floodplain. It is the primary step to reduce the risk. The building should be built on an elevated area. The flood control alarming or aiming reduced flood damage by reforestation and clearing of debris in waterlogging areas is very important. Finally, we can go for the cyclones. Cyclones, they affect the structures and they damage the whole engineered structures. Casualties are more due to flying elements, contamination of water, high winds, damage the coconut and plantain trees, and they are the most vulnerable trees, and fresh water may be polluted by saline water, etc. And severely they also affect the communications. Mitigation is by means of multi-purpose cyclone resistant shelters can be built, and construction near the coastal areas are avoided. Hazard mapping is the best tool, and vulnerable areas should be kept for parks, playgrounds or grazing lands. Agencies like government, both national and international or state level, NGOs and community groups, both social and religious, and international volunteer organization are needed to save the lives and property. Now I think by this small topic or lecture, you can understand how a disaster manager can control the after effects of disaster by simple methods of planning and thinking of alternate communication systems, thinking of better livelihood and avoiding the affected areas or avoiding living near the risk zones, and even we can train the students as well as the adults and communities to reduce the disaster effects. Planning and prevention and mitigation. Planning and prevention gives you about how to reduce the risk. This can be done by three most important points: prevent habitation in risk zones, finding way to reduce risk, community education and awareness. Out of all these things, community education and awareness is very, very important. Finally, I would like to inform all students to participate in NSS, NCC programs. This NSS and NCC program can help you or develop yourself by undergoing certain trainings. The NSS and NCC programs, they organize disaster management trainings, mock drilling, etc. This disaster management training will be helpful in communicating to the different communities. You can just go to the different places of your village or in and around your places and conduct small workshops or trainings or gives a small lecture on these topics so that people can understand what is disaster and how they can mitigate it. For example, you can just create a small group and make it as a disaster labs or disaster groups and ask them to learn about the disaster management. By giving certain examples, creates an environment, and then you give mock experimentation and allow the students to do the same thing or allow the communities to do the same thing and understand clearly about the disaster. Ultimately, disaster management can be avoided by our own planning and by our own awareness programs. We can just create awareness among every alternate person or every alternate student. This is the best practice where we can make understand the importance of disaster manager and how to manage the disaster. Finally, we will go for the references. We are very thankful to Google search engine for providing us the best images and some of the data, and literature collected from CBSE books and NCERT, and finally the BRAOU study material.
మా కార్యక్రమాలపై మీ సూచనలు సలహాలు తెలియచేయండి. మీ సూచనలు సలహాలు తెలియచేయవలసిన చిరునామా: డైరెక్టర్, ఆడియో విజువల్ ప్రొడక్షన్ అండ్ రీసెర్చ్ సెంటర్, డాక్టర్ బిఆర్ అంబేద్కర్ ఓపెన్ యూనివర్సిటీ, ప్రొఫెసర్ జి రామరెడ్డి మార్గ్, రోడ్ నంబర్ 46, జూబ్లీ హిల్స్, హైదరాబాద్ 500033.